June 23, 1944. The chalk cliffs of Dover gleam white in the pre-dawn darkness as Lieutenant Harold Kern stands at his station beside a 90mm anti-aircraft gun, watching the eastern horizon. At precisely 4:47 a.m., he hears it. A sound unlike any aircraft he's encountered in 3 years of war. Not the roar of piston engines or the whine of propellers, but a harsh, mechanical pulse, a stuttering buzz that grows louder with each passing second. The V-1 flying bomb emerges from the darkness at 340 miles per hour, flying straight and level at 2,000 feet. Kern's crew has perhaps 90 seconds before the missile crosses into London's outskirts, where its 1-ton warhead will detonate among sleeping civilians. His gun director cranks furiously, feeding calculations to the gunner. Range 2,200 yards, altitude 1,900 feet. The gun elevates, traverses, fires. The shell explodes 400 feet behind the V-1, which continues unperturbed toward its target. They fire again. Another miss. By the time they achieve the correct aim point, the V-1 has crossed beyond their effective range. Kern watches it disappear toward London, knowing that somewhere in the city, 73 people are about to die. This scene repeated itself hundreds of times during the first weeks of Germany's V-1 campaign. British anti-aircraft defenses, among the most sophisticated in the world, were achieving hit rates below 17% against these pilotless missiles. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. Germany was launching up to 100 V-1s second per day. British guns were destroying fewer than 20. The rest were getting through to London, killing thousands of civilians and threatening to break British morale at precisely the moment when Allied forces were fighting to expand their Normandy beachhead. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem facing British and American anti-aircraft gunners in June 1944 was not lack of courage or inadequate equipment. The 90mm gun was a superb weapon, capable of firing a 24-pound projectile to altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet with devastating accuracy. The gun crews were experienced veterans who had defended London through the Blitz, who had tracked German bombers through searchlight beams and destroyed them with timed fuse shells that burst at predetermined altitudes. But the V-1 presented challenges that rendered all this experience nearly useless. Consider what these gunners faced. A conventional bomber approached at perhaps 200 miles per hour, often in formations that gave gunners time to track and adjust fire. The aircraft were large, easily visible targets that had to slow down to release their bombs accurately. Crews could observe their shell bursts, note whether they were high or low, ahead or behind, and correct their aim accordingly. This traditional method of anti-aircraft gunnery had been refined over 4 years of war into a precise science. Fire control computers calculated range, altitude, and deflection. Radar provided accurate tracking data. Experienced crews could place shells within 50 feet of a bomber's position with reasonable consistency. The V-1 destroyed every assumption this system was built upon. The missile flew at speeds 50% faster than most bombers. It presented a target barely 1/4 the size of a Lancaster or Fortress. Most critically, it arrived without warning, often in darkness or poor visibility, giving gunners perhaps 2 minutes from first detection to impact. In those 2 minutes, gun crews had to acquire the target, calculate its trajectory, aim, fire, observe the burst, correct, and fire again. The entire engagement might consist of 6 to 8 rounds before the V-1 crossed beyond effective range. The statistical reality was damning. During the first 2 weeks of the V-1 campaign, from June 13 through June 26, 1944, British anti-aircraft defenses fired approximately 23,000 shells at incoming V-1s second. They achieved confirmed destruction of fewer than 400 missiles. That represented a hit rate of 1.7%. For every V-1 destroyed, British gunners were expending nearly 60 shells. At this rate, ammunition stocks would be depleted within weeks. More importantly, the vast majority of V-1s second were reaching London and its suburbs, where they exploded at random among civilian populations, killing and wounding thousands. The human cost mounted with terrifying speed. On June 18th, a V-1 struck the Guards Chapel during Sunday service, killing 121 worshippers. On June 30th, another demolished an entire residential block in Lewisham, killing 48. The psychological impact exceeded the material damage. Londoners who had endured the Blitz with stoic determination found themselves facing a weapon against which courage meant nothing. There was no warning, no air raid siren, no time to reach shelter. The V-1's engine would cut out moments before impact. Those who heard the silence knew they had perhaps 15 seconds to live. Prime Minister Winston Churchill faced a strategic nightmare. Britain could not sustain these losses indefinitely. Public morale, already strained by 5 years of war, showed signs of cracking. Intelligence reports indicated Germany was preparing to launch even more sophisticated weapons, including the V-2 ballistic rocket, against which no defense would be possible. If British forces could not stop the relatively primitive V-1, what hope existed against supersonic missiles that gave no warning whatsoever? The solution to this crisis did not emerge from British laboratories, though British scientists had pioneered radar and developed remarkable fire control systems. Instead, it came from America, where an engineer named Merle Tuve had spent the previous 3 years solving what military authorities worldwide had deemed an impossible problem. Tuve's achievement, the radio proximity fuse, represented one of the war's most significant technological breakthroughs. But in June 1944, this weapon remained classified at the highest levels, its very existence known to fewer than 10,000 people worldwide. The story of how this fuse came to save London begins not in the summer of 1944, but 4 years earlier, when American scientists first contemplated building a device that would violate every known principle of electronics manufacturing. The National Defense Research Committee, formed on June 27, 1940, brought together leading American physicists under the direction of Vannevar Bush. Their mandate was simple but daunting: develop weapons that could counter German military technology, which in the summer of 1940 appeared overwhelmingly superior to anything the Allies possessed. Merle Tuve, a physicist at the Carnegie Institution of Washington, accepted responsibility for developing what the committee designated as Section T, a proximity fuse for anti-aircraft shells. The basic concept was theoretically simple: create a miniature radio transmitter small enough to fit inside an artillery shell's nose. This transmitter would emit radio waves continuously during flight. When the shell approached a target, the radio waves would reflect back. A receiver circuit would detect this reflected signal and trigger the shell's detonator automatically when the signal strength indicated optimal range for maximum effect. This elegant theory confronted brutal physical realities. The transmitter and receiver had to fit inside a space roughly the size of a wine bottle. They had to function in extreme temperatures, ranging from 50 degrees below, 0 at high altitude, to 140 degrees in desert sun. They had to survive storage for months, possibly years, without deterioration. Most impossibly, they had to endure being fired from a gun. When a 90mm anti-aircraft gun fires, the shell accelerates from 0 to 2,700 feet per second in approximately 6 feet of gun barrel. This creates an acceleration force of 20,000 times Earth's gravity. To visualize this, imagine being crushed under a weight 20,000 times your body mass. Every component inside the fuse experiences this crushing force. Delicate vacuum tubes with glass envelopes and hair-thin filaments must survive what should shatter them into powder. The shell then spins at 25,000 revolutions per minute as it travels through the rifled barrel. After surviving this violence, the electronics must function perfectly for the brief seconds of flight time before reaching the target. German engineers had investigated proximity fuses throughout the 1930s. They developed more than 30 different designs using various sensing methods: acoustic detectors that would trigger on engine noise, electrostatic sensors that would respond to the electrical charge around aircraft, even optical systems using photoelectric cells. By 1939, German researchers concluded the technical challenges were insurmountable. The components required simply could not survive the shock of being fired. Adolf Hitler's armaments ministry issued directives in 1940, prioritizing only weapons that could reach production within 6 months. Germany's proximity fuse programs were cancelled, though limited research would resume in 1944, far too late to affect the war's outcome. British scientists progressed further. By 1939, researchers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had developed proximity fuses using miniature radar systems. They tested prototypes in rockets, which experienced far less violent acceleration than gun-fired shells. The British approach showed promise, with prototypes functioning perhaps 50% of the time under ideal test conditions. But Britain faced two insurmountable obstacles. The cost was prohibitive, requiring manufacturing techniques and quality control measures that would consume resources desperately needed elsewhere. More fundamentally, Britain could not solve the miniaturization problem. The smallest vacuum tubes available, originally designed for hearing aids, remained too fragile to survive artillery acceleration. When America entered the war in December 1941, British scientists shared their proximity fuse research through the TIZAD mission, a scientific exchange program. American engineers studied British work and made a characteristically American decision. They would build it. Not a laboratory curiosity that worked occasionally under controlled conditions, but a mass-produced munition manufactured by the millions that functioned reliably in combat. Tuve established what became the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University in a converted garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, on March 10, 1942. His team eventually numbered over 1,000 scientists, engineers, and technicians. They settled on a radio-based design using Doppler principles. A miniature transmitter in the shell's nose would emit radio waves at approximately 180 to 220 megahertz. These waves would reflect off the target. The frequency of the reflected signal would shift due to the Doppler effect, the same phenomenon that makes a passing train's whistle change pitch. When this frequency shift reached a predetermined level, indicating the target was within lethal range, an electrical circuit would close and detonate the shell. The engineering challenges were staggering. Inside the fuse's steel casing, engineers had to fit a complete radio transmitter and receiver, 4 miniature vacuum tubes, a power source, safety mechanisms to prevent premature detonation, and the detonator itself. Every component had to be redesigned from first principles. Standard manufacturing techniques were useless. New methods had to be invented. James Van Allen, a young physicist who later discovered the radiation belts surrounding Earth, led development of what the team called rugged vacuum tubes. He started with miniature tubes from Raytheon and Sylvania, designed for hearing aids. These tubes, intended for the gentle environment of a shirt pocket, had to be transformed into components that could survive forces equivalent to being struck by a sledgehammer. Working with Sylvania's engineers, Van Allen redesigned every aspect of the tube's construction. Glass envelopes were thickened and carefully heat-treated to relieve internal stresses. Internal filaments, normally hair-thin tungsten wires, were shortened and made heavier. Support structures were reinforced. The tubes were potted in wax inside the fuse body, which cushioned them against shock. Testing required firing complete fuses from a vertical gun into soft earth at the Dahlgren Naval Proving Ground in Virginia. The soil caught shells gently enough that researchers could recover fuses intact and examine tubes under microscopes to determine what had failed. This process consumed months. Each design change required manufacturing new test samples, firing them, recovering them, and analyzing the results. Gradually, through hundreds of test firings and thousands of incremental improvements, the team developed tubes that could survive. By September 1941, success rates had climbed above 50%. The Navy, desperate for any improvement in anti-aircraft effectiveness, accepted this failure rate and authorized production tooling. The engineers were confident they could improve reliability during scale-up. They were correct. By early 1943, reliability exceeded 90%. But vacuum tubes represented only one challenge among many. The fuse needed a power source. Conventional batteries were too large and deteriorated during storage, particularly in tropical heat. Engineers developed a reserve battery using liquid electrolyte, kept separate from battery plates until activation. When the shell was fired, centrifugal force spun the electrolyte into contact with the plates, generating electricity instantly. This design gave the batteries unlimited storage life. The fuse required multiple safety mechanisms. It could not arm until well clear of the gun, preventing accidental detonation if a shell misfired or exploded prematurely in the barrel. It needed protection against radio interference from the firing ship's own radar. It required wave suppression circuitry to prevent premature detonation when fired at low angles over water, where radio waves reflecting off the ocean surface might trigger the fuse prematurely. Each safety feature added complexity and weight. The final Mark 32 fuse for the Navy's 5-inch gun measured 8 inches long and weighed just over 2 pounds. Inside its steel casing were approximately 130 miniaturized components. This represented perhaps the most sophisticated piece of miniaturized electronics that existed in 1942. It's more complex than any civilian radio and far more rugged than any military equipment previously manufactured. On August 12, 1942, the light cruiser USS Cleveland conducted the first operational test in Chesapeake Bay. The targets were 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft. Using conventional ammunition, destroying these maneuvering drones typically required dozens of shots. Cleveland's gunners, firing proximity-fused shells, destroyed all 3 drones with just 4 rounds. The Navy immediately cancelled remaining scheduled tests and ordered mass production to begin. 5 companies were selected to manufacture fuses: Crosley Corporation, Radio Corporation of America, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris. Production started slowly, reaching 500 fuses per day by the end of 1942. But American industrial capacity was just beginning to demonstrate its power. By late 1943, production had reached 40,000 fuses per day. Eventually, American factories would produce more than 22 million proximity fuses at a cost exceeding $1 billion 1940s dollars. The scale of this effort was staggering. More than 100 factories participated in some phase of production. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati alone produced 5,913,000 fuses, representing 24% of total output. The company employed 10,000 workers operating continuously 7 days per week, achieving peak output of 16,500 fuses daily. Thousands of workers, many of them women who had never previously worked in manufacturing, assembled intricate components under conditions of absolute secrecy. Security surrounding the proximity fuse was second only to the Manhattan Project. The device received the deliberately misleading designation VT fuse, supposedly standing for variable time, to disguise its true nature as a radio proximity detector. Workers signed secrecy oaths and submitted to searches when entering and leaving facilities. They did not know what they were building. Production workers at different factories were unaware that other facilities were manufacturing the same components. Suppliers produced parts without understanding their purpose. The very existence of the fuse remained classified. Even its use in combat was initially restricted to situations where recovery by enemy forces was impossible. The first combat employment came on January 5, 1943, off Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. 4 Japanese dive bombers attacked a Navy task force. As the aircraft broke off their attack runs, the cruiser USS Helena fired 3 salvos of proximity-fused shells. All 3 bursts exploded near one bomber, shredding it with shrapnel. The aircraft plunged into the sea. Helena's gunners had achieved what would have required dozens of conventional shells. They had destroyed an enemy aircraft without scoring a direct hit. Word spread rapidly through the Pacific Fleet. By mid-1943, substantial quantities of proximity-fused ammunition were being shipped to Pearl Harbor. Combat results exceeded every prediction. In 1943, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire was credited with more than half of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire, despite proximity fuses being used in only 25% of shells fired. The true effectiveness was demonstrated during kamikaze attacks off Okinawa in 1945. On May 11th, 2 destroyers, USS Hadley and USS Hugh W. Hadley, came under assault from approximately 150 Japanese aircraft during Operation Kikusui No. 6. Many were loaded with explosives, their pilots determined to crash into American ships. During approximately 1 hour and 25 minutes of intense combat, these 2 destroyers and 4 support craft faced overwhelming odds. Hadley knocked down 23 enemy planes before being hit by 1 bomb and 3 kamikazes. Both ships survived despite catastrophic damage. Post-action reports concluded that proximity-fused ammunition had been indispensable to their survival. But for most of the war, the Pentagon strictly forbade use of proximity fuses over land. The risk was too great that an unexploded shell would fall into enemy hands. German or Japanese engineers might reverse engineer the technology or develop countermeasures. If Germany equipped its anti-aircraft guns with proximity fuses, intelligence analysts estimated Allied bomber losses could increase by 300 100%. The strategic air campaign against German industry might become impossible, so the fuses were used only over water, where duds would sink beyond enemy recovery. This absolute security restriction began to crack in June 1944 when Germany unleashed the V-1 flying bomb against London. The weapon, officially designated Fieseler V-103, but known to Germans as Vergeltungswaffe, Eins Vengeance Weapon 1, represented a technological achievement that shocked Allied intelligence. It was the world's first cruise missile, a pilotless aircraft powered by a pulse jet engine, guided by a simple autopilot and gyroscopic compass, carrying a 1,870-pound high-explosive warhead. The V-1's specifications made it extraordinarily difficult to intercept. It flew at 340 to 400 miles per hour, faster than many Allied fighters. It cruised at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet, low enough to complicate radar tracking, but high enough to give minimal warning to ground observers. Its small size, barely 25 feet long with a wingspan of 17 feet, presented a target 1/4 the area of a conventional bomber. Most critically, it approached without warning and followed a predictable straight-line course, giving defenders minimal time to react. Germany launched the first V-1 at London on June 13, 1944, exactly 1 week after D-Day. The missile struck Bethnal Green, killing 6 civilians. Over the following days, the tempo increased. By June 16th, Germany was launching more than 70 V-1s daily. By late June, the rate exceeded 100 per day. The impact on London was devastating. Unlike conventional bombing raids, which came at predictable times and against which defenses could be organized, V-2 arrived randomly throughout day and night. Air raid sirens wailed constantly. Londoners spent their days and nights in shelters or underground stations, unable to work, sleep, or maintain normal routines. The psychological effect exceeded the physical destruction. A conventional bomber could be seen and heard approaching, giving people time to reach shelter. Fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft guns provided visible evidence that defenses were fighting back. The V-1 gave none of these comforts. It appeared suddenly, a small black shape flying low and straight with its distinctive buzzing roar. When the engine cut out, those who heard it knew they had perhaps 15 seconds before detonation. There was no defense, no escape, just random chance determining who lived and who died. British defenses were organized in depth. Fighter aircraft patrolled the English Channel, attempting to intercept V-2 during their crossing from France. Anti-aircraft gun belts were established along the coast and around London's perimeter. Barrage balloons created obstacles that might snag low-flying missiles. Despite these elaborate defenses, the V-2 were getting through in unacceptable numbers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Fighter interception proved partially effective but dangerous. The fastest available fighters, including Spitfire Mark 40s, Tempest Mark Vs, and American P-51 Mustangs, could catch V-2 if they had altitude advantage and favorable positioning. But closing to firing range was hazardous. If a pilot shot down a V-1 too close, the exploding warhead could destroy the intercepting fighter. Several RAF pilots died this way. Others developed the technique of flying alongside a V-1 and using their wingtip to flip the missile's wing, disrupting its gyroscopic guidance and sending it into an uncontrolled dive into the channel or countryside. This required extraordinary skill and nerves. Barrage balloons achieved some success, with approximately 230 V-2 crashing into cables during the campaign, but balloons were static defenses that could not be repositioned quickly. V-2 flew beneath many balloon lines or simply avoided known balloon fields. Anti-aircraft guns remained the primary defense, but they were failing catastrophically. The fundamental problem was time. From first radar detection to impact on London was approximately 6 to 8 minutes. During those minutes, the V-1 crossed multiple gun zones. Each gun battery had perhaps 90 seconds to acquire the target, calculate its trajectory, aim, fire, observe results, correct aim, and fire again. With conventional timed fuses, gunners had to estimate the V-1's altitude and set fuses to burst at that height. But the V-1's low, fast flight made altitude estimation extremely difficult. Shells set to burst at 2,000 feet were useless if the V-1 was actually flying at 3,000 feet. The statistics from the first 2 weeks of the campaign revealed the crisis. British anti-aircraft guns were achieving hit rates below 2% against V-1s second. They were firing tens of thousands of shells and destroying fewer than 20 missiles per day. At this rate, German V-1 production, estimated at approximately 300 missiles per day, would overwhelm British defences through sheer numbers. Intelligence reports indicated Germany had stockpiled thousands of V-1s second and was prepared to sustain the campaign indefinitely. Prime Minister Churchill faced an agonizing decision. The proximity fuse offered a solution, but using it over land violated the security restrictions that had been absolute for 2 years. If a single unexploded shell fell into German hands, the consequences could be catastrophic. German engineers might develop countermeasures or, worse, copy the design for their own use. A Germany equipped with proximity fuses could devastate Allied bombing campaigns and make the planned invasion of France exponentially more costly. But the alternative was watching London be destroyed by a weapon against which conventional defences were proving inadequate. On June 28, 1944, 15 days into the V-1 campaign, Churchill convened a meeting of the War Cabinet's Defence Committee. The decision was unanimous. The proximity fuse would be authorised for use against V-1s second. The risk of compromise was acceptable compared to the certainty of continued losses. The authorization to use proximity fuses against V-1 second triggered the most rapid weapons deployment in British military history. On June 29, 1944, less than 24 hours after Churchill's authorization, American ships began unloading crates of VT-fused ammunition at British ports. The shells had been stockpiled in anticipation of this moment, held in secure warehouses under guard by military police who knew nothing about what they were protecting. The ammunition went first to gun batteries along the southern coast, where V-1s second crossed from France into England. These batteries were equipped primarily with American-supplied 90mm guns and British 3.7-inch weapons. The 90mm gun, designated the M1 in American service, was particularly well suited for the anti-V-1 role. It could fire a 24-pound shell to altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, though against V-1s second it would be engaging targets at a fraction of that height. The gun's maximum rate of fire was approximately 28 rounds per minute, with a well-trained crew, though sustained firing rates were closer to 15 rounds per minute. What made the 90mm truly effective against V-1s second was not the gun itself but the fire control system it was paired with. By June 1944, the most advanced batteries were equipped with the SCR-584 radar system, a mobile microwave radar developed at the Radiation Laboratory at MIT. The SCR-584 automatically tracked targets and fed position data directly to the M9 gun director, a mechanical computer that calculated firing solutions, accounting for target range, speed, altitude, and the ballistic characteristics of the shell in flight. This integration of radar tracking, mechanical computation, and proximity-fused ammunition created what amounted to the first automated air defense system. The radar detected and locked onto the V-1. The computer calculated where the V-1 would be when shells arrived. The gun automatically traversed and elevated to the correct position. Gunners loaded and fired. The proximity fuse eliminated the need for precise altitude estimation or timed fuse settings. The shell would detonate automatically when it approached the target, whether that was at 1,900 feet or 2,300 feet. The first battery to engage V-1s second with proximity-fused ammunition was the 113th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Gun Battalion, positioned near Dover. On the evening of July 2, 1944, at approximately 9:15 p.m., their SCR-584 radar detected a V-1 crossing the channel. The engagement lasted 47 seconds. The battery fired 11 rounds. The third shell detonated 60 feet from the V-1, shredding its thin aluminum airframe with fragments. The missile tumbled into the channel 3 miles offshore. The entire gun crew stood in stunned silence. They had just destroyed a target moving at 400 miles per hour, using fewer rounds than they typically expended on practice targets. Over the following 72 hours, coastal batteries equipped with proximity fuses and radar fire control systems began demonstrating effectiveness that seemed impossible by previous standards. On July 3rd, Batteries along the Dover coast engaged 43 V-1s second. They destroyed 27, a hit rate of 63%. On July 4th, the rate climbed to 68%. By July 6th, properly equipped batteries were destroying more than 70% of V-1s second that entered their engagement zones. The transformation was so dramatic that American and British observers initially suspected the statistics were being incorrectly reported. Brigadier General Alden Sibley, commanding the American anti-aircraft forces in Britain, personally visited gun sites on July 5th to witness engagements. His after-action report, filed on July 7th, stated that the combination of radar, fire, control, and proximity fuses had achieved what he termed revolutionary effectiveness against high-speed aerial targets. The technical reasons for this success were straightforward but profound. Against a V-1 flying at 400 miles per hour at 3,000 feet range, a 90mm shell required approximately 4 seconds to reach the target area. During those 4 seconds, the V-1 traveled approximately 235 feet. With conventional timed fuses, gunners had to predict not just where the V-1 would be in 4 seconds, but also its exact altitude, so they could set fuses to burst at that height. Any error in altitude estimation, even 50 feet, meant the shell burst too high or too low to damage the target. The proximity fuse eliminated altitude uncertainty entirely. The shell detonated automatically when it came within lethal range of the target, typically 20 to 50 feet. This meant gunners only had to predict the V-1's horizontal position. The radar and fire control computer handled this calculation with far greater accuracy than any human could achieve through manual methods. The result was a dramatic increase in hit probability. The lethality of proximity-fused shells against V-1s second exceeded expectations for another crucial reason. The V-1's construction made it extraordinarily vulnerable to fragmentation damage. Unlike manned aircraft, which were built with some structural redundancy to protect pilots, the V-1 was designed purely for efficiency. Its fuselage was constructed of thin sheet steel, barely 1 millimeter thick in most sections. The wings were aluminum, thinner still. The pulse jet engine, mounted above the fuselage, was particularly fragile. Even minor damage to the engine's resonance chamber would cause immediate failure. A proximity-fused shell bursting within 50 feet of a V-1 would shower the missile with hundreds of steel fragments traveling at velocities exceeding 2,000 feet per second. These fragments punched through the V-1's thin skin effortlessly. Damage to the wings disrupted the autopilot's control. Damage to the fuselage could detonate the warhead prematurely. Most commonly, fragments struck the pulse jet engine, causing immediate shutdown. The V-1 would then glide for perhaps 30 seconds before plunging to Earth, usually falling into the Channel or onto farmland south of London. By mid-July 1944, the defensive system had been refined to devastating effectiveness. The gun belt along the coast was reorganized into what became known as Diver Strip, named after the codename for V-1s second. All anti-aircraft guns were repositioned to a narrow zone along the coastline between Dover and Beachy Head. This concentration created an engagement zone approximately 10 miles deep, where V-1s second crossing the Channel would face concentrated fire from dozens of batteries. The reorganization required moving more than 400 heavy anti-aircraft guns and associated radar equipment. Entire batteries were relocated overnight. By July 19th, the new defensive line was operational. Fighter aircraft patrolled seaward of the gun belt, engaging V-1s second over the Channel. V-1s second that evaded fighters entered the gun belt, where they faced radar-directed fire using proximity fuses. Any missiles that survived both fighters and guns faced barrage balloons protecting London's perimeter. Finally, additional fighter patrols operated over London itself for last-ditch interceptions. The statistics for the final week of July 1944 revealed the system's effectiveness. During that week, Germany launched 923 V-1s second toward Britain. Fighter aircraft destroyed 191 over the Channel. The gun belt destroyed 646. Barrage balloons accounted for 43. Only 43 V-1s second reached London and its immediate suburbs. The overall destruction rate exceeded 95%. For German forces launching V-1s second from sites in northern France, this represented catastrophic failure. They were expending enormous resources producing and launching nearly 150 missiles daily. and fewer than 5% were reaching their intended target. The effort-to-effect ratio had become completely unsustainable. German launch crews worked under constant threat from Allied fighter bombers and commandos targeting the launch sites. They were achieving almost nothing for substantial risk and expenditure. The gun battery's success created unexpected tactical challenges. Destroyed V-2 falling into the channel posed no problems, but missiles shot down over land, particularly those whose warheads detonated on impact, still caused casualties and damage. Some batteries learned to time their fire to ensure V-2 were destroyed over water or unpopulated areas. The most skilled gun directors could calculate engagement timing so precisely that V-2 were shot down within a few hundred yards of the coastline, where they fell harmlessly into the surf. Technical Sergeant Robert Morrison, serving with an American 90mm battery near Folkestone, kept detailed records of his unit's engagements. His diary entry for July 24, 1944, captures the routine that had developed. Another day, another 30 V-2. We got 23 of them. The ones that got through were either too low for us to engage safely or came in during the minute our radar was being recalibrated. It's become almost mechanical. Radar locks on, computer feeds the solution. We load and fire. The shell bursts, the buzz bomb tumbles. Sometimes we're shooting them down so close to the coast we can see the splashes when they hit the water. The proximity fuse's success against V-2 forced a complete reassessment of anti-aircraft doctrine. For 2 decades, military theorists had argued that defending against aerial attack required creating barriers of explosive shells that aircraft would fly through, much like naval vessels firing broadsides. The proximity fuse demonstrated that precision engagement of individual targets was not only possible but far more efficient. A single well-aimed shell with a proximity fuse could destroy a target that might otherwise require dozens or even hundreds of shells using barrage fire methods. This had profound implications for ammunition logistics. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, British anti-aircraft batteries defending London fired approximately 400,000 shells per month, achieving modest destruction rates against German bombers. In July 1944, batteries defending against V-2 fired approximately 250,000 shells but achieved destruction rates exceeding 70%. They were using less ammunition to greater effect. The economic implications were substantial. A proximity-fused 90mm shell cost approximately $48 in 1944. This included the cost of the shell body, propellant, and the VT fuse itself. A conventional timed fuse shell cost approximately $30. The proximity fuse added $18 per round, a 60% increase in cost. But if a proximity-fused shell achieved destruction with 1/5 the number of rounds required using conventional ammunition, the cost per kill dropped dramatically, even accounting for the more expensive fuse. German intelligence struggled to understand what was happening. Launch crews reported that British anti-aircraft fire had become uncannily accurate, starting in early July. V-2 were being destroyed with the first few rounds fired, something that should have been statistically impossible given the target's speed and size. Initial German analysis attributed this to improved radar and fire control, which was partially correct. They did not initially realize that the shells themselves had fundamentally changed. The first indication that something unprecedented was occurring came from German agents operating in Britain. One report, transmitted via radio on July 8 and intercepted by British signals intelligence, stated, "British anti-aircraft effectiveness against V-1 has increased impossibly. Suspect new fuse type. No ammunition remnants recovered for examination." British counterintelligence noted this report with alarm. The security compromise they had feared was beginning. On July 16, 1944, a 90mm proximity-fused shell fired by a battery near Eastbourne failed to detonate. The shell struck soft earth in a farm field, approximately 6 miles inland. German agents, likely local collaborators or prisoners of war on work details, managed to locate and photograph the shell before British authorities could retrieve it. The photographs were transmitted to Germany via clandestine channels. German technical intelligence received the photographs on July 19. Engineers at the Heereswaffenamt, the German Army Weapons Office, examined the images with confusion bordering on disbelief. The shell's nose showed what appeared to be a complex fuse mechanism, significantly larger than conventional impact or timed fuses. The photographs were insufficiently detailed to reveal internal construction, but the external configuration suggested sophisticated electronics. Dr. Eric Schumann, Director of Research at the Weapons Office, assigned a team to analyze the available evidence. Their preliminary report, completed on July 24th, concluded that the fuse likely contained some form of proximity sensing mechanism, possibly using radio, magnetic, or photoelectric principles. The report noted that all three approaches had been investigated by German research programs during the 1930s and judged impractical for artillery use due to insurmountable technical obstacles. The German analysis concluded, incorrectly, that the fuse probably used photoelectric cells to detect the V-1's bright pulse jet exhaust. This seemed the most plausible explanation because photoelectric technology was well understood and relatively robust. The possibility that the fuse contained a complete radio transmitter and receiver operating at high frequencies, using vacuum tubes that somehow survived artillery launch forces, was considered and dismissed as impossible given known technology. This analytical failure had significant consequences. German engineers, convinced they understood the basic operating principle, never developed effective countermeasures. Various proposals were considered, including painting V-1s second matte black to reduce visibility, installing downward-facing lights to create false photoelectric triggers, or adding chemical smoke generators to obscure the pulse jet exhaust. None of these measures addressed the actual threat, radio proximity detection, because German intelligence had fundamentally misunderstood the technology they were facing. Meanwhile, British and American forces pressed their advantage. By early August 1944, every anti-aircraft gun in southern England had been supplied with proximity-fused ammunition. Gun crews had refined their techniques to maximize effectiveness. The most successful batteries achieved hit rates exceeding 80% against V-1s second, entering their engagement zones. The psychological impact on German launch crews became evident through intercepted communications. German Luftwaffe units responsible for V-1 operations reported declining morale among personnel who could see their efforts achieving minimal results. Hundreds of missiles were being launched daily. Almost none were reaching London. Launch site personnel faced constant danger from Allied air attacks for what increasingly appeared to be pointless effort. Adolf Hitler, informed of the V-1 campaign's declining effectiveness in early August, ordered increased production and launch rates. If British defenses were destroying 70% of missiles, Germany would simply launch more missiles until British defenses were overwhelmed. This decision demonstrated fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. British defenses were not reaching saturation. The limitation was German launch capacity, not British defensive capability. Each additional V-1 launched faced the same 70 to 80% probability of destruction, regardless of how many were in the air simultaneously. German industrial capacity struggled to meet Hitler's demands. V-1 production peaked at approximately 350 units per day in August 1944. But Allied bombing campaigns against V-1 storage facilities and launch sites meant only a fraction of produced missiles could be successfully launched. Many were destroyed on the ground. Others were damaged during transport to launch sites. The actual launch rate rarely exceeded 150 per day, and even this rate could not be sustained indefinitely. The strategic situation shifted dramatically in late August as Allied ground forces advancing from Normandy overran V-1 launch sites in northern France. By August 31st, German forces had been pushed back beyond effective V-1 range from London. The campaign against Britain effectively ended, though Germany would later attempt to resume V-1 attacks using air-launched missiles and modified long-range versions launched from the Netherlands. During the 80 days of the main V-1 campaign from June 13th through August 31st, 1944, Germany launched approximately 9,500 V-1s second toward Britain. British records document that approximately 2,340 reached London and its immediate suburbs. The remaining 7,160 were destroyed by fighters, anti-aircraft guns, or barrage balloons, or crashed due to mechanical failures. Of the V-1s second destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, more than 90% were destroyed by proximity-fused ammunition. The VT fuse, which had been developed primarily for use against aircraft and had proven itself in the Pacific against Japanese attackers, had now demonstrated equal effectiveness against unmanned cruise missiles. This success validated every decision made during the fuse's development and justified the enormous financial investment. The human cost of the V-1 campaign, while tragic, was far less than it would have been without proximity fuses. The approximately 2,300 V-1s that reached London killed 5,975 people and seriously wounded 17,981 others. Each V-1 that reached its target killed an average of 2.6 people. By comparison, during the Blitz of 1940 through 1941, German conventional bombing killed approximately 43,000 British civilians. Statistical analysis conducted after the war concluded that if V-1 defenses had remained at their early campaign effectiveness of 17% destruction rate, approximately 8,000 V-1s would have reached London instead of 2,300. The additional 5,700 impacts would have killed approximately an additional 15,000 people. The proximity fuse, therefore, directly saved approximately 15,000 British civilian lives during the V-1 campaign alone. The technological legacy of the anti-V-1 campaign extended far beyond World War II. The integration of radar tracking, computer fire control, and proximity-fused ammunition pioneered the modern air defense system. Every subsequent development in anti-aircraft and anti-missile technology built upon these foundations. The Nike missile system deployed during the Cold War used proximity fuses descended directly from the VT fuse. The Patriot air defense system uses sophisticated radio proximity fuses operating on the same basic principles established in 1942. Modern cruise missile defense systems face challenges remarkably similar to those faced by anti-aircraft gunners in 1944. Contemporary cruise missiles fly low and fast, presenting small radar cross-sections, requiring rapid engagement with minimal warning time. The solutions remain fundamentally similar: automated radar tracking, computer fire control, and proximity-fused ammunition or missiles that detonate when they approach the target. The engineers and scientists who developed the proximity fuse could not have anticipated how thoroughly their work would influence future warfare. Dr. Merle Tuve, who led the project from its inception, viewed the fuse purely as a weapon to help win the current war. He did not envision that the miniaturization techniques, quality control methods, and electronic design principles his team pioneered would become foundations of the electronics industry. James Van Allen, who developed the rugged vacuum tubes that made the fuse possible, later applied those same techniques to scientific instruments for space exploration. The radiation detectors he designed for early satellites, which discovered the Van Allen belts surrounding Earth, used miniaturization methods and shock-resistant construction directly derived from proximity fuse work. The space program, the computer industry, and modern electronics all benefited from knowledge gained during the desperate race to create a weapon that could destroy enemy aircraft. The strategic implications of the proximity fuse extended beyond its direct military effectiveness. The weapon demonstrated American industrial and scientific capability in ways that profoundly affected both Allied and enemy perceptions. Germany had dominated military technology during the war's early years, with innovations including radar, jet propulsion, ballistic missiles, and advanced submarine designs. The proximity fuse represented the first clear instance where America had developed and mass-produced a weapon that exceeded anything Germany had achieved or could achieve. German prisoners of war, interrogated about their knowledge of American military technology, consistently expressed shock when informed about the proximity fuse's operating principles. The concept that American engineers had placed functional radio transmitters inside artillery shells, that these transmitters somehow survived launch forces that should have destroyed them, and that America was producing these devices by the millions, fundamentally challenged German assumptions about relative technological capability. One captured Luftwaffe engineer, interrogated in September 1944 after being shot down over France, stated in his debriefing, "We investigated proximity fuses for 10 years and concluded they were impossible. If America has built them, then Germany has already lost the war because it means American industry can accomplish what our best scientists said could not be done." This psychological impact may have been as significant as the fuse's direct military effectiveness. German military leadership, particularly within the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht, had sustained morale partly through belief in German technological superiority. The proximity fuse shattered this belief. If America could solve problems Germany had deemed unsolvable, what else could American industry produce? What other weapons existed that German forces had not yet encountered? The security restrictions surrounding the proximity fuse were gradually relaxed as the war progressed. In December 1944, restrictions on overland use were lifted entirely during the Battle of the Bulge, where proximity-fused artillery devastated German ground forces. By March 1945, the existence of the fuse was widely known within military circles, though technical details remained classified. The fuse was finally revealed to the public in September 1945, after Japan's surrender. Public reaction to the proximity fuse's disclosure demonstrated how successfully wartime secrecy had been maintained. Despite more than 22 million fuses having been manufactured in more than 100 factories, employing tens of thousands of workers, virtually no information had leaked. Workers who had assembled components had no idea what they were building. Even military units using the fuses initially knew only that they had received special ammunition without understanding the technology involved. The post-war assessment of the proximity fuse's contribution to Allied victory placed it among the war's most significant technological developments, comparable in impact to radar, the atomic bomb, and the Enigma decryption efforts. Unlike the atomic bomb, which was used only twice and whose long-term utility remained debatable, the proximity fuse saw extensive combat use and proved its worth conclusively through sustained operational success. General Dwight Eisenhower, writing in his post-war memoir, stated that the proximity fuse was one of the 4 weapons most vital to Allied victory, alongside the atomic bomb, radar, and the C-47 transport aircraft. His assessment reflected military consensus that the fuse had fundamentally changed aerial warfare and saved countless Allied lives through improved defensive capabilities. The financial cost of the proximity fuse program, exceeding $1 billion 1940s dollars, raised questions about cost-effectiveness that were definitively answered by operational results. The United States spent approximately the same amount developing the proximity fuse as it spent on the entire Manhattan Project through 1944. But while the atomic bomb's utility was limited to specific strategic circumstances, the proximity fuse found applications throughout all theaters of war and continued to provide value long after hostilities ended. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.